There's nothing quite like the ache of a house that's too quiet, where every creak of the floorboards echoes the absence of the family that should be there. Colt Ashford knows this loneliness well. At 34, he's built a cattle empire in Wyoming, but comes home each night to empty rooms and cold supper. He lost his brothers in the war and his father to the harsh land. Now he needs a wife to give him sons and carry on his name. When young schoolmistress Maybelle Quinn arrives to teach the ranch children, Colt sees his answer. She's smart, strong, and everything his future needs. But Maybelle has her own plans and won't be claimed like cattle. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object on the American frontier? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn painted the Wyoming sky in shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the sprawling Ashford ranch. Colt stood on the wide porch of his two-story log home, steam rising from the coffee cup in his weathered hands as he surveyed the empire he'd built from nothing but determination and back-breaking work. 2,000 head of prime Hereford cattle dotted the valley below, their rust-colored hides a stark contrast against the endless sea of prairie grass that stretched to the distant mountains. The house behind him was a testament to his success-solid timber walls, chinked with precision, wide plank floors that could support 100 dancing couples, and windows large enough to frame the magnificent vistas in every direction. But for all its grandeur, the structure felt more like a monument to loneliness than a home. Every room echoed with the absence of voices, of laughter, of the small daily sounds that made a house feel alive. In the parlor, positioned near the great stone fireplace, sat an empty rocking chair that had belonged to his mother. The leather-bound family Bible rested on the small table beside it, its worn cover bearing the fingerprints of 3 generations of Ashfords. Inside its yellowed pages, names were carefully inscribed in fading ink: births, marriages, deaths, the sacred record of a bloodline that now rested solely on Colt's broad shoulders. His father's strong hand had written the last entry. Thomas Ashford, died January 15th, 1879, aged 58 years, gone to join his beloved sons in the Lord's embrace. Colt's jaw tightened as he remembered that bitter winter when pneumonia had taken the old man. By then, James and Samuel Ashford were already 5 years in their graves, casualties of Gettysburg and Antietam respectively. The war had claimed the best of the family, leaving only Colt to carry forward a name that deserved better than to die with him. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention back to the present. His foreman, Miguel Santos, rode up the dusty path leading a string of horses, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. Miguel had been with the ranch for 8 years, a steady man with calloused hands and an understanding of cattle that bordered on mystical. Behind him rode 3 other ranch hands. Charlie, barely 20 but strong as an ox. Old Pete, whose real name nobody remembered but whose skill with rope was legendary, and Tom Bradley, a former cavalry sergeant who'd found peace in ranch work after the war. "Morning, boss," Miguel called out, touching the brim of his hat. "We've got 30 head need moving to the north pasture today. Water's running low in the south." Colt nodded, finishing his coffee. "Take Charlie and Pete with you. Tom, I want you checking fence lines along the eastern boundary. Had reports of wolves in the area." The men acknowledged his orders with the easy respect that came from years of working together. They were good men, loyal and hard-working, but they had their own families to return to each evening. Miguel's wife, Rosa, kept house for them in the small cabin by the creek, their 3 children filling their modest home with the kind of joy that Colt envied more than he cared to admit. As the hands rode off to begin their work, Colt made his way to the barn, where his stallion, Thunder, waited in his stall. The massive black horse had been his companion through countless long days on the range, and like his master, seemed to carry himself with a kind of noble solitude. Colt saddled the animal with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and sure. The morning rounds took him across vast stretches of his domain. He checked water levels at the creek, examined cattle for signs of illness or injury, and rode the fence lines that marked the boundaries of his success. Every acre had been earned through sweat and sacrifice, every head of cattle representing hours of careful breeding and protection from the harsh realities of frontier life. But as impressive as his holdings were, they felt hollow without someone to share them with, someone to pass them on to. At 34, Colt was acutely aware that he was no longer a young man by frontier standards. Most men his age had wives and children, legacies secured through the simple act of loving and being loved in return. The problem wasn't lack of opportunity. Over the years, several young women in the territory had made their availability known, their fathers eager to align themselves with the prosperous Ashford name. But something had always held him back, perhaps the memory of his parents' deep devotion to each other, or maybe just the knowledge that marriage should be about more than convenience and social standing. Still, practical considerations couldn't be ignored forever. The ranch needed heirs, and Colt needed sons strong enough to continue what he'd built. It wasn't romantic, but it was honest, more honest than the pretty words and false promises that seemed to pass for courtship these days. By midday, he'd returned to the main house for dinner, which Rosa prepared and left warming on the stove. The simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread filled his stomach, but did nothing to ease the emptiness that seemed to grow larger with each passing year. He ate in silence at the long dining table that could seat 12 but rarely hosted anyone but himself. After the meal, he walked to his study, a room lined with leather-bound ledgers that chronicled every aspect of ranch operations. The numbers told a story of consistent growth and sound management. Cattle prices were strong, the herds were healthy, and the land produced good grass year after year. By any measure, Colt Ashford was a successful man. But success, he'd learned, was a cold companion on long winter nights. He opened the family Bible and stared at the blank lines waiting to be filled. Somewhere out there was a woman capable of bearing strong sons, someone who could take her place in these pages and ensure that the Ashford name continued long after he was gone. The thought wasn't romantic, but it was necessary. The sound of a wagon approaching interrupted his brooding. Through the window, he saw Miguel driving the supply wagon back from town, but there was an extra passenger seated beside him, a young woman in a simple blue dress and matching bonnet. Even from a distance, there was something about her posture that suggested strength and purpose. Colt watched as Miguel helped the woman down from the wagon, handling a worn leather satchel and a small trunk with careful respect. She stood for a moment, surveying the ranch buildings with an appraising eye that suggested intelligence and perhaps a touch of skepticism. When she turned toward the house, Colt caught a glimpse of determined features and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. This, he realized, must be the new schoolmistress that Miguel had mentioned hiring on behalf of the ranching families in the area. The previous teacher had married a merchant and moved back east, leaving the children of the ranch hands without education for nearly 6 months. Finding a replacement willing to come this far from civilization had proven challenging. He closed the Bible and made his way to the front porch, arriving just as Miguel and the young woman approached. "Boss, this here's Miss Maybelle Quinn," Miguel said, his usual informal manner replaced by something approaching reverence. "Miss Quinn, this is Mr. Colt Ashford, owner of the spread." Colt touched his hat brim in greeting, taking his first close look at the woman who would be teaching the local children. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 19 or 20, but there was nothing childish about the way she carried herself. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical style beneath her bonnet, and her green eyes held a directness that was both refreshing and slightly unsettling. "Miss Quinn," he said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy his mother had drilled into him years ago. "Welcome to the territory. I trust your journey wasn't too difficult." "The journey was long but bearable, Mr. Ashford," she replied, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested Eastern education. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve the children of this community." There was something in her manner, a combination of politeness and independence, that immediately captured his attention. This wasn't a timid girl seeking adventure on the frontier. This was a woman with purpose and conviction. "The schoolhouse is about a mile from here," Colt explained. "Miguel will show you to your quarters. If you need anything for your teaching, just let him know." She nodded, but her gaze remained steady on his face. "I understand the children have been without formal education for some time. I plan to assess their needs and develop appropriate lessons." "That's good," Colt said, finding himself impressed by her professional approach. "Education's important out here. These children will need all the advantages they can get." As Miguel prepared to escort Miss Quinn to the schoolhouse, Colt found himself reluctant to see her go. There was something about her presence that seemed to fill a space in the air around them, making the afternoon feel less empty than it had in years. "Miss Quinn," he called after her as she turned to leave, "perhaps you'd join me for supper tomorrow evening. I'd like to discuss your plans for the children's education." She paused, considering his invitation with the same careful attention she'd given everything else since her arrival. "That would be appropriate, Mr. Ashford. Thank you for the invitation." As he watched the wagon disappear down the path toward the schoolhouse, Colt felt something he hadn't experienced in years' anticipation. For the first time since his father's death, the empty rocking chair on his porch didn't seem quite so accusatory. Perhaps, just perhaps, the answer to his loneliness had arrived in the form of a determined young schoolmistress with intelligent green eyes and a backbone made of steel. The family Bible in his study seemed to whisper of possibilities, of blank lines waiting to be filled with new names and new beginnings. Tomorrow's supper couldn't come soon enough. The next evening arrived with the kind of golden light that made the Wyoming landscape look like something from a painting. Colt had spent more time than usual preparing for supper, changing his shirt twice, and even running a comb through his dark hair. He told himself it was simple. Courteous man should look presentable when entertaining a guest, but the flutter of nervousness in his chest suggested something deeper. The schoolhouse bell had rung clearly across the valley that afternoon, its bronze voice carrying news that formal education had returned to their corner of the territory. From his porch, Colt had watched children emerge from the small building, their faces bright with the excitement of learning. The sound of that bell-strong, purposeful, unwavering seemed to embody everything he'd observed about Miss Quinn herself. Rosa had outdone herself preparing the meal, roast beef with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and apple pie made from the last of the preserved fruit from town. The dining room, so often a cavern of echoing silence, had been set with his mother's good china and the silver candlesticks that rarely saw use. When Miguel arrived with Miss Quinn promptly at 6 o'clock, Colt felt his breath catch slightly. She had changed from her practical teaching dress into something more suitable for dining, a deep green gown that brought out the color of her eyes and suggested she understood the importance of the occasion without being ostentatious about it. "Miss Quinn," he said, offering his arm to escort her into the house. "I hope your first day with the children went well." "Very well, thank you," she replied, accepting his escort with natural grace. "They're bright children, though some are quite behind in their letters and numbers. Nothing that dedication and patience can't remedy." As they entered the dining room, Colt watched her take in the formal setting without comment, though he caught a slight widening of her eyes at the obvious effort that had been made. She allowed him to seat her at the table, her manners suggesting the same Eastern education evident in her speech. "This is quite lovely, Mr. Ashford," she said, unfolding her napkin. "You have a beautiful home." "It's large," he replied, pouring wine for both of them. "Sometimes too large for one person." The comment hung in the air between them as they began their meal. For several minutes, they maintained polite conversation about the weather, the quality of the grazing land, and her impressions of the territory. But Colt found himself studying her more than listening to his own words. There was an intelligence in her eyes that seemed to catalogue and assess everything around her, and a composure that suggested she wasn't easily impressed or intimidated. "Miss Quinn," he said finally, setting down his fork, "I'd like to speak plainly with you, if I may." She paused in her eating, meeting his gaze directly. "I appreciate plain speaking, Mr. Ashford. Please, go ahead." Colt took a breath, knowing that what he was about to say would either begin something important or end it before it could start. "I'm 34 years old, and I've built something substantial here. This ranch, these cattle, this land, it's all worth something, but it's not complete." "Oh?" Her voice remained level, but he could see her attention sharpen. "I need a wife," he continued, his words measured and deliberate. "Not for companionship, though that would be welcome. Not for romance, though I hope that might come in time. I need a wife to give me sun-strong sons who can carry on what I've built here." The silence that followed was profound. Miss Quinn set down her water glass with careful precision, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality he hadn't heard before: steel wrapped in silk. "I see. And you're telling me this because you're exactly what I'm looking for," Colt said, leaning forward slightly. "You're intelligent, strong, and you understand the value of hard work. You could make a good life here, and together we could build something that would last beyond our lifetimes." Another pause, longer this time. When Miss Quinn picked up her napkin and dabbed at her lips, the gesture seemed to mark the end of one phase of the conversation and the beginning of another. "Mr. Ashford," she said finally, "I came to this territory to teach children, not to become someone's broodmare." The word hit him like a physical blow, though he kept his expression neutral. "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" She leaned back in her chair, her green eyes flashing with something between anger and disappointment. "You've known me for exactly 24 hours, and you're already planning how many sons I might bear you. You speak of me as if I'm a prize heifer you're considering for breeding." Colt felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I spoke honestly about my needs and what I could offer in return. That's more than most men would do." "Most men," she replied, her voice growing sharper, "would at least pretend to be interested in who I am as a person before reducing me to my reproductive capabilities." "I'm interested in who you are," he protested. "That's why I asked you to dinner, why I wanted to discuss." "You wanted to interview me for a position," she interrupted. "The position of Mrs. Colt Ashford, mother of future ranch heirs. Tell me, what salary does this position offer?" The mockery in her tone stung more than he'd expected. "I would provide for you well. You'd want for nothing. Except choice. Except the right to determine my own future." She stood from the table, her napkin falling to the floor. "Except the possibility that someone might value me for my mind, my character, my dreams, not just my ability to produce male children." Colt rose as well, his own frustration building. "Dreams don't build lasting legacies, Miss Quinn. Dreams don't ensure that everything a man works for survives beyond his own life." "And love?" she asked, her voice suddenly quiet. "Where does love fit into your grand plan for legacy building?" The question caught him off guard. Love had always seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford, a romantic notion that had little place in the practical realities of frontier life. But looking at her now, at the fire in her eyes and the proud set of her shoulder, she felt something stir that might have been the beginning of understanding. "Love," he said carefully, "might come with time, if two people respect each other, work together toward common goals." "Common goals?" She shook her head, a bitter smile playing at her lips. "Your goals, you mean? Your ranch, your cattle, your sons to carry on your name." "What about my goals, Mr. Ashford? What if I don't want to spend my life bearing children for a man who sees me as little more than a means to an end?" "What do you want?" he asked, genuinely curious despite his frustration. "I want to matter," she said simply. "I want to make a difference in the world, to use my education and abilities for something more than just producing the next generation of Ashfords. I want to be valued for who I am, not what I can provide." The schoolhouse bell, visible through the dining room window, caught the last rays of sunlight and seemed to gleam with purpose. It represented everything she weighs: education, independence, the power to shape young minds and influence the future in ways that had nothing to do with bloodlines or inheritance. "Miss Quinn," Colt said, his voice softer now, "I may have expressed myself poorly, but my intentions are honorable. I'm offering you a partnership, a chance to build something together." "You're offering me servitude disguised as partnership," she replied, "and I'm not interested." She moved toward the door, pausing only when he called her name. "I have everything a woman could want," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Land, cattle, a good name, financial security. What more could you ask for?" She turned back to face him, and in her expression he saw something that made his chest tighten pity. "You have everything, Mr. Ashford," she said quietly, "except the ability to see women as anything more than a means to your ends. Until that changes, you'll have nothing that matters." The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the empty house like a gunshot. Colt stood alone in his dining room, surrounded by the remnants of a meal that had been meant to begin something, but had instead revealed the vast distance between his practical worldview and her romantic ideals. Outside, the schoolhouse bell stood silent in the growing dusk, its bronze surface dark now but somehow still radiating the strength and purpose it had rung with that afternoon. Like the woman who rang it each day, it served a higher calling than simple utility. For the first time in years, Colt Ashford wondered if he had been thinking about everything, including love, entirely wrong. The morning after the disastrous dinner, Colt found himself unable to concentrate on his usual ranch duties. Every time he tried to focus on cattle counts or fence repairs, Miss Quinn's words echoed in his mind. "You have everything except the ability to see women as anything more than a means to your ends." He'd spent a sleepless night pacing his empty house, replaying every moment of their conversation. In the harsh light of dawn, he was forced to admit that perhaps his approach had been too direct, too businesslike. But wasn't honesty better than the flowery deceptions that seemed to pass for courtship these days? By mid-morning, he found himself riding toward the schoolhouse, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been shame. He told himself he was simply checking on the progress of the children's education, reasonable concern for a prominent member of the community. The sound of young voices reciting their alphabet drifted from the small building as he approached. Through the open window, he could see Miss Quinn standing at the front of the classroom, her posture straight and commanding as she guided 8 children through their lessons. On her desk sat a small hand-carved wooden doll, its simple features painted with care and dressed in tiny scraps of calico. Miguel's youngest daughter, 6-year-old Carmen, clutched a similar doll to her chest as she struggled with her letters. The child had been painfully shy since her mother's difficult recovery from fever the previous winter, barely speaking above a whisper, even to her own family. "Carmen," Miss Quinn said gently, kneeling beside the little girl's desk, "can you show me the letter that sounds like the beginning of your doll's name?" The child pointed tentatively to a letter on her slate, and Miss Quinn's face lit up with genuine delight. "That's exactly right. And what sound does day make?" "Duh," Carmen whispered, her dark eyes brightening slightly. "Perfect. Now can you think of other words that start with that sound?" Colt watched from outside as the lesson continued, noting how Miss Quinn seemed to understand exactly what each child needed. She was patient with Tom Bradley's boy, who struggled with numbers, and challenged Charlie's quick-witted nephew with more advanced reading. But it was her gentle encouragement of little Carmen that struck him most deeply. The wooden doll served as more than just a teaching aid. It was a bridge between the child's need for comfort and her growing confidence with letters and words. Miss Quinn had somehow understood that learning required not just instruction, but also a sense of safety and acceptance. When the children were dismissed for their midday meal, Colt tied his horse to the hitching post and approached the schoolhouse door. Miss Quinn looked up from organizing papers on her desk, her expression cooling noticeably when she saw him. "Mr. Ashford," she said with careful politeness, "is there something you need?" "I wanted to apologize," he said, removing his hat and holding it awkwardly in his hands. "For last night, I spoke poorly." She set down her papers and studied his face for a long moment. "You spoke honestly, which I suppose is something. But honesty without consideration for the other person's feelings is simply cruelty dressed up as virtue." The observation stung because it was accurate. "I'm not accustomed to speaking with women about such matters," he admitted. "My parents had an arranged marriage that grew into love over time. I suppose I assumed. You assumed I would be grateful for the opportunity to bear your children and ask no questions about it. She finished. Tell me, Mr. Ashford, what do you know about me beyond the fact that I'm unmarried and of childbearing age? The question caught him off guard. He realized with uncomfortable clarity that he knew almost nothing about her background, her interests, or what had brought her to Wyoming territory. I know you're educated, he said finally. I know you're good with children. I know you're not afraid of hard work or challenging situations. Those are observations, not knowledge, she replied. You don't know where I came from, what I've sacrificed to be here, or what my hopes are for the future. You saw a suitable candidate and made an offer, like you might for purchasing livestock. The comparison made him wince, but he pressed on. Then tell me, help me understand. She hesitated, as if weighing whether he was worth the effort of explanation. Finally, she gestured to the wooden doll on her desk. I carved that for Carmen, she said. She reminded me of myself at that age, too shy to speak up, too frightened to take risks. My father believed education was wasted on girls, but my mother taught me to read in secret. When he discovered our lessons, he burned my books and forbade her from filling my head with nonsense. Colt felt something tighten in his chest at the pain in her voice. I earned my teaching certificate by working in a factory 12 hours a day and studying by candlelight, she continued. I saved every penny for 2 years to afford the journey here. This position represents everything I've worked, for the chance to make sure other children, especially girls like Carmen, never have to choose between education and family approval. I didn't know, he said quietly. Of course you didn't. You didn't ask. She picked up the wooden doll, turning it over in her hands. This represents more than just a teaching aid, Mr. Ashford. It represents the right of every child to learn, to grow, to become more than what others expect of them, including girl children who might grow up to want something more than marriage and motherhood. The rebuke was gentle but clear. Colt found himself looking at her with new eyes, seeing not just the competent teacher or potential wife, but a woman who had fought for every opportunity she'd been given. What can I do to make amends? He asked. Respect my position here, she said. Let me do the work I came to do without pressure or expectations beyond those related to education. He nodded, though part of him wanted to argue that his interest in her went beyond mere practical considerations. There was something about her strength and determination that drew him in ways he didn't fully understand. The children seem to be learning well, he said, changing the subject to safer ground. They are, she agreed, her manner warming slightly. Carmen spoke up in class today for the first time. Tom's boy is beginning to understand multiplication. They're all capable of more than anyone expected. Like their teacher, Colt said without thinking. She glanced at him sharply, as if trying to determine whether the comment was sincere or merely flattery. Whatever she saw in his expression seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slightly. Perhaps, she said, time will tell. As Colt prepared to leave, he found himself reluctant to end the conversation. For the first time since her arrival, they had spoken without anger or misunderstanding, and he was beginning to glimpse the woman behind the teacher's professional facade. Miss Quinn, he said, pausing at the door, would you consider joining me for supper again sometime? Not to discuss marriage or children, but simply to continue getting to know each other better. She considered the invitation with the same careful attention she gave everything else. Perhaps, she said finally, when I feel confident that you see me as a person rather than a solution to your problems. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. As Colt rode back to his ranch, he found himself thinking not about sons or legacy, but about a woman brave enough to carve wooden dolls for lonely children and strong enough to travel halfway across the country for the chance to make a difference in the world. 3 weeks passed before Colt worked up the courage to extend another dinner invitation. During that time, he found himself making frequent trips past the schoolhouse, always with some reasonable excuse checking on fence repairs, discussing ranch business with Miguel, or delivering supplies. Each time, he lingered a bit longer, listening to the sound of Miss Quinn's voice as she guided the children through their lessons. He began to notice things he'd missed before, the way she celebrated each small victory with genuine enthusiasm, her patience when explaining difficult concepts, and the growing confidence in the children who had been shy and uncertain just weeks earlier. Little Carmen now raised her hand eagerly to answer questions, and Tom's boy had stopped dreading arithmetic lessons. When Colt finally approached Miss Quinn after school on a crisp October afternoon, he carried with him a small wrapped package and a carefully rehearsed invitation. "Miss Quinn," he said, his hat in his hands, "I wonder if you might join me for supper this Sunday. I promise the conversation will be entirely proper and focused on getting to know each other better, nothing more." She looked up from the papers she was grading, studying his face with those intelligent green eyes. "What's in the package, Mr. Ashford?" He felt heat rise in his cheeks. "A small gift. Not an attempt to buy your acceptance, just something I thought you might appreciate." She accepted the package with careful hands, unwrapping it to reveal a leather-bound volume of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Inside the front cover, in his careful script, he had written, "For Miss Quinn, in appreciation of her dedication to education and the children of our community." "This is beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "Thank you, but I'm curious, why poetry?" "I noticed you had a book of poems on your desk last week," he admitted. "The binding was worn, as if it had been read many times. I thought perhaps you enjoyed the form." For the first time since their disastrous first dinner, she smiled at him with something approaching warmth. "I do enjoy poetry. It was one of the few luxuries my mother allowed herself to share with me, reading verses aloud while we worked in the evenings." "Then you'll accept my invitation?" "I will," she said, closing the book carefully. "Thank you for thinking of my interests, Mr. Ashford. It shows consideration I didn't expect." Sunday evening found them seated at his dining table once again, but the atmosphere was markedly different from their first meal together. The formal china remained, but Colt had chosen simpler fair-roast chicken with vegetables from Rosa's garden, fresh bread, and apple cider from the trees behind the house. "Tell me about your family," Miss Quinn said as they began eating. "You mentioned losing your brothers in the war." Colt felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with thoughts of James and Samuel. Reaching into his vest pocket, he withdrew a small silver locket on a chain, something he'd carried since his father's death, but never shown to another soul. "This was my mother's," he said, opening the locket to reveal a tiny painted portrait of a woman with kind eyes and dark hair. "She died when I was 16, just before James and Samuel enlisted. My father gave this to me the day he passed, along with the responsibility for carrying on the family name." Miss Quinn leaned forward to examine the miniature portrait, her expression softening. "She was beautiful. You have her eyes." "Do I?" Colt had never noticed the resemblance, but looking at Miss Quinn's gentle expression as she studied the locket, he felt a stab of longing for the mother he barely remembered. "Tell me about them," she said quietly. "Your brothers." And so he did. For the first time in years, Colt found himself speaking about James's quick wit and love of books, Samuel's skill with horses, and his dream of starting his own ranch someday. He talked about the day they left for war, how young and eager they'd looked in their blue uniforms, and how the house had felt empty even before the official word of their deaths arrived. "I was supposed to go with them," he confessed, surprised by his own honesty. "But my father needed help with the ranch, and someone had to stay. I've always wondered if things might have been different if I'd been there." "You might have died alongside them," Miss Quinn said gently. "Then who would have built all this? Who would have carried on their memory?" The observation struck him with unexpected force. He'd spent so many years focused on the burden of being the sole survivor that he'd never considered the possibility that his survival had been necessary, even meaningful. "You carry them with you," she continued, nodding toward the locket. "In your memories, in the success you've built, in the way you honor their sacrifice by living fully. That's a kind of immortality, isn't it?" Colt felt something shift inside his chest, as if a weight he'd carried for years was slowly beginning to lift. "I never thought of it that way." "Perhaps," she said with a small smile. "You've been too busy building their monument to realize you'd already created it." They talked long into the evening, the conversation flowing with an ease that surprised them both. Miss Quinn told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her mother's quiet rebellion in educating her daughter, and her determination to use that education to help other children achieve their dreams. Colt shared stories of building the ranch from nothing, of the challenges and satisfactions of frontier life, and of his growing respect for the woman sitting across from him. "I owe you an apology," he said as the evening wound down. "When I first met you, I saw only what you could provide for my future. I failed to see what you'd already accomplished on your own." "And what do you see now?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the lamplight. "I see a woman who carved a wooden doll to help a shy child find her voice. I see someone who traveled across the country to chase a dream that many people would call foolish. I see strength and kindness and intelligence that has nothing to do with my needs or wants." "That's progress," she said with a gentle smile. "Is it enough progress to earn another dinner invitation?" he asked hopefully. "It's enough to earn consideration," she replied, "which is more than you had before." As Miguel arrived to escort her back to the schoolhouse, Colt felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not the desperate hope of a man trying to solve a problem, but the quiet anticipation of someone beginning to understand that the best things in life couldn't be planned or purchased, only discovered through patience and genuine connection. The silver locket seemed warmer in his pocket as he watched her leave, as if his mother's memory was somehow blessing this tentative beginning. For the first time since inheriting the burden of family legacy, Colt began to wonder if perhaps love and duty didn't have to be opposing forces after all. As autumn deepened into winter, Colt and Miss Quinn settled into a pattern of weekly dinners and increasingly comfortable conversation. The rigid formality of their early encounters gave way to genuine friendship, though both remained carefully aware of the unspoken tensions that simmered beneath their growing rapport. The change in their relationship didn't go unnoticed by the community. Rosa began humming while she prepared their Sunday meals, and Miguel started making pointed comments about how much happier his boss seemed these days. The children at the schoolhouse spoke excitedly about Miss Quinn and Mr. Ashford, as if they were characters in one of the fairy tales she sometimes read aloud. But it was Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of local propriety, who made the community's expectations most clear. She arrived at the schoolhouse on a grey November afternoon, her considerable bulk wrapped in furs and her expression radiating disapproval. "Miss Quinn," she announced without preamble, "I've come to discuss your situation with Mr. Ashford." Maybelle, for she had finally given Colt permission to use her, given name looked up from the arithmetic problems she was preparing for the next day's lessons. On her desk, the wedding ring that had belonged to Mrs. Henderson's late mother-in-law caught the light from the window. The older woman had presented it as a loan the previous week, claiming it would be perfect for when the time comes. "What situation would that be, Mrs. Henderson?" Maybelle asked, though she suspected she knew exactly what the woman meant. "The man has been courting you for 2 months now," Mrs. Henderson said, settling her bulk into one of the student chairs with obvious difficulty. "Sunday dinners, gifts, long conversations on his porch where half the territory can see you. It's time you made your intentions clear." "My intentions?" Maybelle set down her pen with careful precision. "I wasn't aware that my personal relationships were subject to community approval." "Everything is subject to community approval out here, young lady," Mrs. Henderson replied tartly. "We can't afford to have unmarried women leading our children astray with inappropriate behavior." The accusation stung, particularly because Maybelle knew there was some truth to the community's concerns. Her growing attachment to Colt was becoming harder to hide, and their weekly dinners had begun to extend into long walks and quiet conversations that felt increasingly intimate. "What exactly are you suggesting I do?" Maybelle asked. "Marry him, of course," Mrs. Henderson said as if it were obvious. "He's the wealthiest man in the territory. You're of proper age and background, and everyone can see you suit each other. What more is there to consider?" The ring on the desk seemed to gleam with expectation, its simple gold band representing centuries of tradition and social pressure. Maybelle found herself thinking of her mother, who had married her father not for love but for security, and had spent 30 years regretting the choice. "Perhaps I prefer to make my own decisions about marriage," Maybelle said quietly. "Prefer?" Mrs. Henderson laughed harshly. "Child, you're 19 years old with no family and no prospects beyond this teaching position. Colt Ashford is offering you more than you could reasonably hope for. Don't let foolish romantic notions ruin the best opportunity you'll ever have." That evening, when Colt arrived for their usual Sunday dinner, he found Maybelle unusually quiet and distracted. She went through the motions of conversation, but her responses lacked their usual spark, and she seemed to be studying him with a new kind of wariness. "Is something troubling you?" he asked finally, setting down his coffee cup. She hesitated, then told him about Mrs. Henderson's visit and the community's expectations. As she spoke, she twisted the borrowed ring on her finger, the gesture drawing his attention to the symbol he'd never seen her wear before. "Where did you get that?" he asked, nodding toward the ring. "Mrs. Henderson brought it," she admitted. "She said it would be perfect for when we announce our engagement." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Colt felt his heart rate increase, though he couldn't tell if it was from excitement or panic. "And what did you tell her?" he asked carefully. "I told her I make my own decisions," Maybelle replied. "But she made it clear that the community expects us to marry soon. Apparently, our friendship has become a source of speculation and concern." Colt was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with emotions he couldn't quite name. Over the past 2 months, his feelings for Maybelle had evolved far beyond his original practical considerations. She had become the bright spot in his days, the person he most wanted to share his thoughts and experiences with. But the idea of marriage still carried the weight of duty and expectation that made him feel trapped. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want to keep teaching," she said immediately. "I want to continue helping these children learn and grow. I want to feel like my life has purpose beyond just fulfilling social expectations." "That's not what I meant," he said gently. "What do you want from us?" "From this?" He gestured between them. She was quiet for so long that he began to fear he'd pushed too hard. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to matter to someone," she said. "Not as a solution to their problems or a means to their ends, but as myself. I want to wake up each morning knowing that someone is glad I exist for no reason other than that I'm me." The simple honesty of her words hit him like a physical blow. In that moment, he realized that somewhere along the way, his feelings for her had transformed from need to something deeper and more frightening. "You matter to me," he said, surprised by the roughness in his own voice. "More than I expected, more than I planned for." "But not enough to marry without the community's pressure," she observed. He wanted to deny it, but couldn't. The truth was that marriage still felt like surrendering his independence, like taking on obligations he wasn't sure he was ready for. "I need time," he said finally. "Time for what?" "To decide if you can tolerate being married to me, to determine if I'm worth the inconvenience." There was hurt in her voice now, mixed with frustration. "Time to understand what I'm feeling," he said honestly. 2 months ago, I thought I knew exactly what I wanted from a wife. Now I find myself caring about your happiness more than my own plans, and I don't know what to do with that." She studied his face in the lamplight, searching for something he hoped she would find. Finally, she pulled the ring from her finger and set it on the table between them. "I won't be pressured into marriage by community expectations," she said firmly. "And I won't be kept in limbo by a man who can't decide if he wants me or just needs me. When you figure out the difference, we can continue this conversation." The ring caught the light as she stood to leave, its simple band seeming to mock the complexity of their situation. Colt wanted to call her back, to find words that would bridge the gap between his growing feelings and his lingering fears. But the words wouldn't come, and he was left alone with the weight of his own uncertainty. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the familiar landscape in a blanket of white that made everything look different, transformed. Like his feelings for the woman who had just walked out of his house, leaving him to wonder if he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early December, delivered by the territorial mail carrier, along with supplies from town. Colt noticed it immediately among the usual correspondence, thick envelope with elegant handwriting addressed to Miss Maybelle Quinn, Ashford Valley School. The return address bore the seal of the Philadelphia Board of Education. Miguel, who had picked up the mail, handed it to Colt with a puzzled expression. "This one's for the schoolmistress," he said. "Looks important." Colt stared at the envelope, a cold dread settling in his stomach. Philadelphia was a long way from Wyoming territory, and official correspondence rarely brought good news to the frontier. He tucked the letter into his coat pocket, telling himself he would deliver it after the school day ended. But as the hours passed, the envelope seemed to burn against his chest like a brand. By afternoon, he could no longer concentrate on ranch business and found himself riding toward the schoolhouse with a sense of impending doom. He arrived just as Maybel was dismissing the children for the day. The past 3 weeks had been strained between them, their easy friendship replaced by polite distance. She still came to Sunday dinners, but the conversations felt forced, and both of them seemed to be walking on ice that might crack at any moment. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice carefully neutral as the last child departed. "Is there something you need?" He dismounted and approached the schoolhouse, the letter feeling heavier with each step. "This came for you with today's mail," he said, extending the envelope. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the return address. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside. Colt watched her face as she read, noting the way her eyes brightened with each paragraph. "Good news?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "The Philadelphia School District is offering me a position," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "A permanent teaching position at one of their finest schools, with a salary twice what I earn here and access to the latest educational methods and materials." She looked up from the letter, her green eyes bright with excitement and something that might have been relief. "They heard about my work here through a former colleague who recommended me. The position would begin in the spring term." Colt felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. That's wonderful news," he managed, though the words felt like glass in his throat. "It is, isn't it?" She folded the letter carefully, as if it were made of precious metal. "I'd always dreamed of teaching in a real city school, with proper resources and students who could go on to university. I never thought such an opportunity would come to me. You're going to accept it." It wasn't a question. She paused, studying his face with an expression he couldn't read. "I haven't decided yet, but it's tempting, very tempting." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Colt found himself thinking of all the conversations they'd shared, all the small moments that had gradually built into something he'd been too afraid to name. The thought of her leaving, of the schoolhouse falling silent again, of his Sunday evenings returning to empty solitude, filled him with a panic he'd never experienced. "What would it take to make you stay?" he asked quietly. "I told you," she replied. "When you figure out the difference between wanting me and needing me, we can continue our conversation. And if I asked you to marry me right now today?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Maybelle set the letter down on her desk, next to the handwritten lesson plans and the wooden doll that had become Carmen's constant companion. "Is that what you're doing?" she asked. "Asking me to marry you?" Colt opened his mouth to say yes, then stopped. The truth was, he didn't know if his desperation to keep her here came from love or simply from the fear of losing something that had become precious to him. The distinction mattered to her, and increasingly, to him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I know I don't want you to leave. I know that the thought of you in Philadelphia, living a life that doesn't include me, makes me feel like I'm drowning. But I don't know if that's love or just selfishness." For the first time in weeks, she looked at him with something approaching warmth. "At least you're being honest about your uncertainty. That's progress. Is it enough progress to make you consider staying?" She picked up the letter again, reading through it once more before answering. "Colt, I came to Wyoming territory because I wanted to make a difference in the world. These children have become precious to me, and the work we're doing here feels important. But this opportunity, it's everything I trained for, everything I dreamed of. What about us? The question escaped before he could stop it, revealing more vulnerability than he'd intended. What about us? She countered. 3 weeks ago, you couldn't decide if you wanted to marry me or just needed someone to bear your children. Now, faced with the possibility that I might leave, you're suddenly ready to propose. That doesn't sound like love, Colt. That sounds like desperation. Her words stung because they were accurate. But underneath the desperation, he was beginning to recognize something deeper, a genuine affection that had grown despite his best efforts to keep his feelings practical and manageable. You're right, he said finally. I am desperate, but not just because I need a wife or because I'm afraid of being alone. I'm desperate because somewhere along the way, you became important to me in ways I never expected. When I think about my future now, you're in it. Not as a solution to my problems, but as a partner I want to share my successes and failures with. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the letter. And what if I can't give you children? What if the sons you need for your legacy never come? The question caught him off guard. In all his practical planning, he'd never considered that possibility. But as he looked at her now, at her intelligence, her strength, her dedication to the children, Tauth realized that his definition of legacy had been changing without his knowledge. Then we'd build a different kind of legacy, he said, surprised by his own certainty. These children you're teaching, the difference you're making in their lives, that matters too. Maybe more than bloodlines. Tears gathered in her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly. You've changed, she said softly. So have you, he replied. When you first arrived, you were so focused on proving your independence that you couldn't see that partnership doesn't have to mean surrender. And now I think we've both learned that the best things in life can't be planned or demanded. They have to be chosen freely and willingly. She stood up from her desk, the letter still clutched in her hand. I need time to think about this. The position in Philadelphia, what you've said today, what I want for my future. It's all too important to decide in haste. How much time, he asked, though he dreaded the answer. Until Christmas, she said. Give me until Christmas to decide. As he rode home through the gathering dusk, Colt found himself thinking not about cattle or land, or the practical concerns that had dominated his thoughts for so many years. Instead, he thought about a woman with intelligent green eyes who had carved wooden dolls for shy children and had somehow carved out a place in his heart without him realizing it. The handwritten letter from Philadelphia lay folded in her desk drawer, representing a future that might take her away from him forever. But for the first time since her arrival, Colt understood that love wasn't about possession or need, it was about wanting someone else's happiness, even when it might come at the cost of your own. Christmas was still 2 weeks away when Dr. Morrison made his unexpected visit to the Ashford ranch. The elderly physician had served the territory for nearly 20 years, treating everything from broken bones to difficult births with the quiet competence that came from decades of frontier practice. His arrival on a cold December afternoon, without being summoned, immediately set Colt on edge. "Doc," Colt said, meeting the man at his door, "is someone hurt? One of the Hans families?" "Everyone's fine, Colt," Dr. Morrison replied, but his expression was grave. "I need to speak with you privately. It's about your medical records from the war." Colt felt his blood turn to ice. He led the doctor into his study, closing the door behind them. On his desk, among the ranch ledgers and correspondence, sat a small, leather-bound medical journal he'd kept hidden for years. Its pages contained pressed flowers that Maybel had given him over the past month, small tokens from their walks together that he'd been saving like a lovesick schoolboy. "What about my war records?" Colt asked, settling into his chair with forced calm. Dr. Morrison pulled out a thick envelope from his medical bag. "I received this from the Army Medical Corps yesterday. They're reviewing old cases, particularly injuries that might have long-term consequences for veterans. Your name came up." The envelope contained Colt's complete military medical file, including detailed reports from the field hospital where he'd been treated after taking shrapnel at Chancellorsville. Colt's hands trembled slightly as he read through the familiar details, the injuries to his abdomen, the weeks of recovery, the discharge papers that had sent him home to help his father with the ranch. "I don't understand why this matters now," Colt said, though a growing dread in his stomach suggested he understood all too well. "The Army is concerned about veterans who might have suffered reproductive injuries without knowing it." "Dr. Morrison explained gently. "The shrapnel damage you sustained was extensive, Colt. There's a strong possibility that it affected your ability to father children." The words hit Colt like a physical blow. For years, he'd pushed aside occasional doubts and concerns, focusing instead on building his ranch and securing his future. The possibility that he might be unable to produce the sons he'd spoken so confidently about had been buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it wasn't real. "How strong a possibility?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Based on the medical reports and similar cases, I'd say it's likely." "Dr. www. Morrison replied. "I'm sorry, Colt. I know how important carrying on the family name is to you." After the doctor left, Colt sat alone in his study, staring at the medical journal, with its pressed, flower-stangible proof of his growing love for a woman he'd originally pursued for her ability to bear his children. The irony was so bitter he almost laughed. All these months, he'd been wrestling with his feelings for Maybelle, trying to separate love from need, romance from practicality. He'd worried about whether he was proposing for the right reasons, whether he could offer her true partnership or just convenient arrangement. Now it seemed the entire foundation of his original interest in her had been built on an impossibility. The pressed flowers seemed to mock him, delicate reminders of moments when he'd begun to see her as more than a means to an end, just as he was discovering that she never could have been that means in the first place. The violet she'd picked during their first walk after the disastrous dinner, the wild rose from the afternoon she'd told him about her childhood, the tiny yellow bloom from just last week, when they'd walked in comfortable silence, and he'd finally understood that he loved her for herself, not for what she could give him. But did she know that? Could she believe it, given how their relationship had begun? The next morning, Colt rode to the schoolhouse earlier than usual, arriving before the children had gathered for their lessons. Maybelle looked up from her preparations, surprised to see him at such an early hour. "Colt, is everything all right?" He dismounted slowly, the medical journal tucked inside his coat like a guilty secret. "I need to tell you something that changes everything." She set down her lesson plans, giving him her full attention. "What is it?" "The Army sent Dr. Morrison some old medical records yesterday. Mine, from when I was wounded in the war." He pulled out the journal, opening it to show her the pressed flowers alongside the official documents he'd tucked inside. "It seems I may not be able to father children. The injuries I sustained, they likely affected my ability to have sons." Maybelle stared at him, her face cycling through surprise, understanding, and something that might have been relief. "How long have you suspected this?" "Part of me has always wondered," he admitted, "but I buried the doubt because it was easier than facing the possibility that everything I thought I wanted might be impossible." "Everything you thought you wanted," she repeated slowly. "Including me?" "No," he said quickly, "not including you. That's what I'm trying to tell you, Maybelle. I pursued you originally because I thought I needed a wife to bear my children. But that's not why I love you now." The words hung in the air between them, the first time he'd spoken them aloud. She looked down at the pressed flowers in the journal, touching them gently with her fingertips. "These are from our walks," she said softly. "I saved them because they reminded me of moments when I was happy," he said, "not because I was building towards some practical goal, but because being with you made me feel alive in ways I'd forgotten were possible. And now that you know you might not be able to give me children, now I'm terrified that you'll think my feelings aren't real," he said honestly, "that you'll believe this confession is just another manipulation, another way of trying to keep you from accepting the position in Philadelphia." She closed the journal carefully, her fingers lingering on the leather cover. Do you know what I thought when you first told me you needed a wife to bear you sons?" He shook his head. "I thought you were the most honest man I'd ever met," she said. "Brutal in your honesty, yes, but honest nonetheless. Most men would have courted me with pretty words and false promises, waiting until after the wedding to reveal their true expectations. I should have." "No," she interrupted, "you shouldn't have. Your honesty, as painful as it was to hear, gave me the chance to know exactly what I was refusing. And later, when you began to change, when you started seeing me as a person rather than a solution, I could trust that change because I knew you were capable of uncomfortable truths." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that this changes nothing about how I feel about you," she said firmly. "If anything, it confirms what I'd begun to hope, that your feelings for me have nothing to do with what I can provide, and everything to do with who I am." Relief flooded through him so powerfully he had to sit down on the schoolhouse steps. "Even if we can never have children of our own?" "Even then," she said, settling beside him, "we'd have other ways to build a family, other ways to leave a legacy. These children I teach, for instance, they could be our legacy too." He looked at her in wonder, this woman who had somehow seen past his clumsy attempts at courtship to the man he was trying to become. "I don't deserve you," he said. "Perhaps not," she said with a small smile. "But you love me and I love you, and that's enough to build on." The schoolhouse bell began to ring in the distant sonore, the call to class, but the celebratory pealing that announced good news to the community. Colt realized that Miguel must have seen them together and drawn his own conclusions about what was happening. "Is that your answer about Philadelphia?" Colt asked. "That's my answer about everything," Maybelle replied, taking his hand. "I choose you, Colt Ashford. Not your ranch, not your cattle, not the children you might or might not be able to give me. I choose you." The medical journal lay between them, its pressed flowers a testament to love that had grown quietly and naturally, like wildflowers in a meadow. What had begun as a practical arrangement had become something neither of them had planned, for a partnership built on honesty, respect, and the kind of love that transcended duty or need. The storm that would trap them together began as innocent-looking clouds on the western horizon 3 days before Christmas. Colt had seen enough Wyoming winters to recognize the signs, the peculiar stillness in the air, the way the cattle bunched together in the lower pastures, the anxious behavior of the horses. But even his experience couldn't have prepared him for the ferocity of what was coming. By Christmas Eve morning, the wind was howling across the valley with the force of a freight train, driving snow horizontally and reducing visibility to mere feet. Colt had spent the early hours ensuring his livestock was secure and his hands safely sheltered in the bunkhouse. The storm was shaping up to be the worst he'd seen in a decade. His thoughts turned immediately to Maybelle, alone in the schoolhouse with only a small wood stove for warmth. The building was sturdy enough, but it hadn't been designed for extended occupancy during severe weather. By midday, when the wind began rattling the windows of his own substantial house, he knew he had to reach her. Fighting through drifts that already reached his waist, Colt made his way to the barn and saddled Thunder. The big stallion was reluctant to venture into the storm, but responded to his master's urgency with the loyalty that had carried them through many difficult situations. The mile to the schoolhouse felt like 10. Several times, Colt lost the path entirely and had to rely on Thunder's instincts to find their way. The wind was so fierce it threatened to unseat him, and the cold cut through his heavy coat like knives. By the time they reached the schoolhouse, both horse and rider were exhausted. Through the frost-covered window, he could see a warm glow from the storm lantern Maybelle kept on her desk. The sight of that steady light in the midst of the chaotic storm filled him with relief and something deeper, profound gratitude that she was safe, that the beacon of her presence still burned bright in his world. He pounded on the door, calling her name over the wind. When she opened it, her face showed the same relief he felt at seeing her, unharmed. "Colt, what are you doing out in this weather?" She pulled him inside, immediately beginning to brush snow from his coat. "I couldn't leave you alone in this," he said, his teeth chattering from cold and exertion. "It's going to get worse before it gets better." As if to prove his point, a particularly violent gust shook the building, rattling the windows and sending a spray of snow down the chimney. The storm lantern flickered but held steady, its warm light creating a circle of comfort in the small space. "I'm glad you're here," she admitted, moving to stoke the fire in the small stove. "I've been listening to the wind for hours, wondering if the building would hold." "It'll hold," Colt assured her, though privately he was concerned about the roof. The schoolhouse had been built for function rather than fortification, and the weight of accumulating snow might test its limits. They settled into an awkward domesticity as the storm raged outside. Maybelle had been preparing lessons for after the Christmas holiday, and the desk was covered with papers and books. The wooden doll that had become Carmen's favorite sat prominently displayed, a reminder of all the small lives Maybelle had touched during her time in the valley. "I wrote to Philadelphia yesterday," she said suddenly, not looking up from the tea she was preparing on the small stove, "to decline their offer." Colt felt his heart skip, though he tried to keep his voice calm. "No regrets?" "None," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "My place is here, with these children, with this community, with you." The simple declaration seemed to warm the small space more effectively than the struggling stove. Colt moved closer to her, close enough to see the determination in her green eyes and the slight smile that played at the corners of her mouth. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. "A Christmas gift, though I hadn't planned to give it to you in a snowbound schoolhouse." What he withdrew was a small carved wooden box, its surface polished to a warm glow. Inside, nestled in silk, was a ring knot, the ornate gold band Mrs. Henderson had pressed upon them, but something uniquely their own. The band was silver, set with a small emerald that matched Maybelle's eyes, and carved around the edges with tiny wildflowers. "I had it made by the jeweler in Cheyenne," Colt explained, his voice uncertain. "The flowers are the same ones we've found on our walks. I hoped—" "It's perfect," she breathed, lifting the ring from its box with reverent fingers. "But Colt, are you asking?" "I'm asking you to marry me," he said, dropping to one knee on the schoolhouse floor. "Not because I need a wife to bear my children, not because the community expects it, but because I love you. Because you've made me understand that a life shared with the right person is worth more than any legacy I could build alone." The storm lantern cast dancing shadows on the walls as she considered his proposal. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault, but inside their small sanctuary, everything felt perfectly still. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand, which, in every way that mattered, it had been. When Colt rose to kiss her, the storm seemed to fade into insignificance, nothing more than nature's dramatic backdrop to the most important moment of their lives. But their celebration was interrupted by an ominous, creaking sound from above. Both of them looked up at the ceiling, where moisture was beginning to seep through the boards. "The roof," Colt said grimly. "The snow load is too much." As if summoned by his words, a section of the ceiling began to sag visibly. They had minutes, perhaps less, before part of the roof would collapse under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. "We need to get out of here," Maybelle said, but when they looked toward the door, they could see that snow had drifted against it to a height of several feet. "The back window," Colt decided. "We can break it out and dig our way to the surface." Working together with desperate efficiency, they gathered the storm lantern, some blankets, and what food Maybelle had stored for emergencies. The wooden doll went into her coat pocket. She wouldn't leave Carmen's treasure behind, even in crisis. The window proved stubborn, frozen shut by ice and wind. Colt had to use a piece of firewood to smash out the glass, sending shards scattering across the snow outside. The opening was small, barely large enough for them to squeeze through one at a time. "You first," he insisted, boosting her toward the window. "What about Thunder?" she asked, suddenly realizing his horse must still be outside somewhere. "He'll find shelter," Colt said, though he worried about the animal. "Horses are smart about storms. He'll be fine." The dig-out was exhausting work. The snow was deep and heavy, packed by the wind into an almost solid mass. But finally, they emerged into the full fury of the storm, gasping in the thin, cold air. "The house!" Colt shouted over the wind, pointing toward his ranch. "It's our only chance." The journey that normally took 15 minutes on foot stretched into an hour of desperate struggle. They took turns breaking trail through drifts that sometimes reached their chests, supporting each other when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. The storm lantern provided their only guidance, its flames somehow managing to stay lit despite the wind. By the time they reached Colt's house, both were near collapse from cold and exertion. But they had made it, and they were together, and the solid walls of the ranch house offered sanctuary from the storm that continued to rage outside. As they huddled together near the fireplace, sharing warmth and the profound relief of survival, Maybelle held up her hand to admire the ring that had somehow stayed secure through their ordeal. "Not quite the proposal story I expected," she said with a shaky laugh. "Nothing about us has been expected," Colt replied, pulling her closer. "Why should our engagement be any different?" Outside, the storm continued its assault on the valley, but inside, two people who had found love in the most unexpected circumstances began planning their future together. The schoolhouse might be damaged. The community might face challenges from the severe weather, but their commitment to each other and to the life they would build together had been tested by nature's fury and had emerged stronger than ever. The storm lasted 3 days, leaving the valley buried under 4 feet of snow and the landscape transformed into an endless expanse of pristine white. When the wind finally stilled and the sun emerged on the morning of December 27th, Colt and Maybelle ventured out to assess the damage to their world. The schoolhouse had suffered as expected. Half the roof had collapsed under the snow load, leaving the interior exposed to the elements. Books and papers were scattered and damaged, desks overturned, and the small stove buried under debris. But miraculously, the storm lantern had survived, found intact among the wreckage like a symbol of hope persisting through disaster. "It can be rebuilt," Colt said, surveying the damage with a practical eye. "Better than before, stronger. The community will come together to make it happen." Maybelle nodded, though her heart ached to see the destruction of the place where she'd found her purpose. "The children will be disappointed when they return from the holiday. They'll be excited to help rebuild," he assured her. "Nothing brings people together like a common project." Over the following weeks, Colt's prediction proved accurate. As soon as the roads were passable, neighbors began arriving with tools, lumber, and offers of assistance. Miguel organized work crews, Rosa coordinated meals for the volunteers, and even Mrs. Henderson put aside her usual criticism to contribute her late husband's carpentry tools. The new schoolhouse rose from the ruins of the old, stronger and more spacious than before. The community had decided to upgrade the structure, adding better insulation, larger windows, and a more efficient heating system. It was during one of these work sessions that Colt made an announcement that surprised everyone, including Maybelle. "I've been thinking about the school's future," he said, addressing the gathered volunteers during their midday break. "Miss Quinn Maybelle has done remarkable work with our children, but she deserves better resources than we've been able to provide." He reached into his coat and withdrew a carefully crafted ring made from polished antler, carved with intricate designs that reflected their shared love of the frontier. It was a replacement for the emerald ring, which had been his formal proposal. This one was different, more personal, more symbolic of their unique situation. "I'm establishing an education fund," he continued, "to ensure that our schoolhouse has the books, supplies, and resources it needs. And I'm asking Maybelle to do me the honor of becoming my wife, so we can work together to give these children the best possible future." The gathered crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Miguel threw his hat in the air, Rosa wiped tears from her eyes, and even stern Mrs. Henderson managed a smile. Little Carmen ran forward to hug Maybelle's legs, her own wooden doll clutched tightly in her arms. "Will you still be our teacher after you're married?" Carmen asked, her dark eyes serious with concern. "Of course I will," Maybelle assured her, kneeling to meet the child's eyes. Being married doesn't mean I stop being your teacher. It just means I'll have help making the school the best it can be." The antler ring fit perfectly on her finger, its natural beauty and frontier craftsmanship somehow more appropriate than any expensive jewelry could have been. It represented their commitment not just to each other, but to the community they served and the life they were building together. "When?" asked Tom Bradley, always practical. "When's the wedding?" Colt looked at Maybelle, raising an eyebrow in question. They had discussed timing in general terms, but had never settled on a specific date. "Valentine's Day," Maybelle said impulsively. "If the new schoolhouse is finished by then, we could hold the ceremony here, where our story really began." "Valentine's Day it is," Colt agreed, taking her hand and admiring how the antler ring looked against her skin. "That gives us 6 weeks to finish the building and plan a proper celebration." The work on the schoolhouse took on new urgency after that announcement. What had been a community project became a labor of love, with everyone eager to ensure that the building would be ready for both the children's return to classes and the wedding that would mark a new chapter in the valley's history. During the long winter evenings, as they planned their wedding and their future together, Colt and Maybelle often talked about what their life would look like. They spoke of the children they would teach and mentor, the improvements they would make to the ranch and the school, and the legacy they would build through service to their community. "Do you ever regret it?" Colt asked one night, as they sat by the fire in his house, soon to be their house. "Giving up the chance for children of our own?" "We'll have children," Maybelle replied, her hand resting on his. "Every child who passes through that schoolhouse will be a little bit ours. We'll shape their minds, influence their futures, help them become the best versions of themselves. That's a kind of parenthood too." The antler ring caught the firelight as she spoke, its carved surface telling the story of their unconventional courtship and their commitment to a love that had grown from the most practical of beginnings into something neither of them could have imagined. Valentine's Day dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant sunshine that made the snow-covered valley sparkle like diamonds. The new schoolhouse stood complete and beautiful, its fresh timber walls glowing golden in the morning light. Inside, the women of the community had worked through the night to transform the space into something worthy of the celebration to come. The wedding quilt that would serve as the centerpiece of the ceremony had been a community effort, spanning the 6 weeks since the engagement announcement. Each family had contributed a square, creating a patchwork story of life in the Wyoming territory. Rosa had stitched a square showing the ranch with its cattle, while Mrs. Henderson had contributed one depicting the original schoolhouse. Carmen's mother had sewn a panel showing children at their lessons, and even the bachelor cowboys had managed to contribute squares showing horses and wildflowers. When assembled, the quilt told the story of their community and served as a wedding canopy under which Colt and Maybelle would exchange vows. It would become their marriage bed covering, and eventually an heirloom to pass down through whatever family they created. Maybelle dressed in her room at the boarding house where she'd been staying since the storm destroyed her quarters at the old schoolhouse. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant cream-colored wool with pearl buttons and lace trim that Rosa had insisted on adding. The antler engagement ring gleamed on her finger, soon to be joined by a matching wedding band that Colt had carved himself during the long winter evenings. As she prepared for the ceremony, Maybelle reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been working in a factory and dreaming of adventure. 6 months ago, she had arrived in Wyoming territory with nothing but her teaching certificate and her determination to make a difference. Now she was about to marry a man who had first seen her as a solution to his problems, but had grown to love her for exactly who she was. Meanwhile, at the ranch house, Colt was struggling with his own preparations. He had never been comfortable with being the center of attention, and the prospect of declaring his feelings publicly in front of the entire community made him more nervous than facing down a charging bull. Miguel found him standing on the porch, staring out at the schoolhouse, where guests were already beginning to gather. "Second thoughts, boss?" Miguel asked with a knowing smile. "No second thoughts about marrying her," Colt replied. "Just worried I'll find a way to mess up the vows. Words have never been my strongest skill. Just speak from the heart, Miguel advised. That woman didn't fall in love with your speeches. She fell in love with who you are when you're not trying to impress anyone. By noon, the schoolhouse was filled with every person in the valley who could make the journey. Children sat cross-legged on the floor in front, while adults occupied the chairs and benches that had been borrowed from every household in the area. The wedding quilt hung from the rafters, its colorful squares creating a canopy of community support over the space where the ceremony would take place. When Maybelle entered the schoolhouse on Miguel's arm, he had volunteered to give her away in the absence of her own family. A hush fell over the gathering. She moved with quiet dignity down the aisle between the desks where she had taught so many children, carrying a simple bouquet of dried wildflowers that had been preserved from their walks together. Colt waited for her at the front of the room, wearing his best suit and looking more nervous than anyone had ever seen him. But when their eyes met, his expression softened into something that made several of the women in the audience reach for their handkerchiefs. The ceremony itself was conducted by the circuit preacher, who had made a special trip through the snow-clogged passes to perform the service. But the words that mattered most were the vows that Colt and Maybelle had written themselves. "Maybelle," Colt said, his voice carrying clearly through the small space, "I once told you that I had everything but a wife to give me strong sons. I was wrong about what I needed, but I was right about one thing: I did need you. Not to bear my children or manage my household, but to teach me that love isn't something you plan or purchase. It's something you discover when you're brave enough to see another person clearly and choose them anyway." Maybelle's voice was steady as she replied, "Colt, you offered me security and partnership, but you gave me something more valuable: the freedom to be myself without apology. You've shown me that true strength isn't about standing alone, but about choosing to stand together with someone who sees your worth even when you can't see it yourself." They exchanged the simple antler rings Colt had carved, each band inscribed with words only they could read: "Choose freely on hers, love wholly on his." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was gentle and full of promise, witnessed by an entire community that had watched their love story unfold. The celebration that followed filled the schoolhouse with laughter, music, and the kind of joy that comes from watching two people find their way to each other despite all obstacles. Rosa had prepared a feast that seemed impossible given their remote location, and someone had produced a fiddle that soon had the whole gathering dancing between the desks and benches. Little Carmen presented them with a special gift, a new wooden doll she had carved herself, this one depicting a bride and groom standing together under a star-filled sky. "For your children," she said solemnly, "when they come." As the evening wound down and the guests began to make their way home through the snow, Colt and Maybelle stood together under the wedding quilt, surrounded by the remnants of their celebration. The schoolhouse that had been destroyed by the storm and rebuilt by the community now held the memory of their wedding, adding another chapter to its story. "Mrs. Ashford," Colt said, trying out her new name. "How does it sound?" "Like home," she replied, leaning into his embrace, "like exactly where I belong." The wedding quilt would travel with them to the ranch house that night, beginning its journey as the covering for their marriage bed. But its presence in the schoolhouse during the ceremony had sanctified the space in a new way, making it not just a place of learning, but a place where love had been declared and witnessed. As they prepared to leave, Maybelle paused to straighten the desks and ensure everything was ready for classes to resume the following Monday. The simple act of tidying the classroom as a newly married woman felt symbolic. She was still the teacher these children needed, but now she was also a wife and partner in building something larger than herself. "Ready to go home?" Colt asked, offering his arm. "I've been ready since the day I met you," she replied. "I just didn't know it yet." They walked out of the schoolhouse together into the clear winter night, the wedding quilt folded carefully in Maybelle's arms and their future stretching out before them like the star-filled Wyoming sky. Behind them, the building that had brought them together stood ready to welcome another generation of children, another chapter in the ongoing story of their community. The antler rings on their fingers caught the moonlight as they walked, symbols of a love that had grown from the most practical of beginnings into something that would endure through whatever challenges the frontier might bring. They had chosen each other freely, completely, and forever. 5 years later, on another Valentine's Day morning, Maybelle Ashford stood in the doorway of the expanded schoolhouse, watching her husband help their newest student, 7-year-old Timothy Chen, whose parents had arrived from California the previous month with his arithmetic problems. The sight filled her with the same warmth that had sustained her through all the changes their life together had brought. The schoolhouse had grown along with the community, now boasting 2 classrooms and serving nearly 30 children from families scattered across the expanding territory. But it was the small pair of shoes sitting on Maybelle's desk that represented the most profound change in their Levestini leather boots, barely worn, that belonged to the newest member of their family. Sarah Rose Ashford had arrived not through birth, as they had once assumed all children must, but through the tragedy that sometimes marked frontier life. Her parents, traveling through the territory the previous winter, had perished in a blizzard, much like the one that had brought Colt and Maybel together. The 18-month-old girl had survived only because a passing cavalry patrol had found her tucked safely in her mother's arms, protected by the ultimate sacrifice of parental love. When Dr. Morrison had asked if anyone in the community could take in the orphaned child, Colt and Maybel had looked at each other across their kitchen table and known without words that their answer would be yes. The little girl with dark curls and solemn brown eyes had been meant for them, just as they had been meant for each other. "She's not the strong son you once said you needed," Maybel had teased gently as they prepared to welcome Sarah Rose into their home. "She's better," Colt had replied, cradling the tiny girl with the same gentle strength he'd once reserved for injured animals. "She's ours." The months that followed had been a revelation. Neither of them had expected the fierce protectiveness that parenthood would awaken, or the way a child's laughter could transform even the most ordinary moments into something precious. Sarah Rose had taken her first steps in the parlor, where the old rocking chair, no longer empty now, served as the center of evening story times and lullabies. But perhaps more surprising was the discovery that their inability to have biological children had freed them to create a different kind of family. The schoolhouse had become a second home to children whose parents worked long hours on distant claims. Miguel's oldest son spent most afternoons there, helping with lessons and earning money for his college fund. Carmen, now 12 and Maybelle's devoted assistant, had become like an older sister to Sarah Rose. "We're building something bigger than bloodlines," Maybel reflected, watching Timothy Chen's face light up as he solved a particularly challenging problem. "We're building a community of minds and hearts." The education fund Colt had established had grown beyond anyone's expectations, supplemented by contributions from families who had prospered and donations from back east sent by former students who had gone on to universities and careers. The schoolhouse now had a proper library, scientific instruments, and even a piano that had been transported at considerable expense from Denver. But the most treasured artifact in the building remained the baby shoes that sat on Maybelle's desk, not just Sarah Rose's first pair, but those that had belonged to every child who had taken their first steps in the schoolhouse during community gatherings. The shoes represented hope, new beginnings, and the promise that each generation would go further than the one before. "Mrs. Ashford," Timothy called out, his English still careful, but improving daily. "I finished the problems. Are they correct?" Maybel moved to examine his work, Sarah Rose toddling along beside her with the determined gait of a child who had learned to walk by following her parents around their daily activities. The little girl had become the schoolhouse mascot, equally at home in the classroom or helping Colt with the gentler ranch duties. "Perfect, Timothy," Maybel said, genuinely pleased with his progress. "Your parents will be so proud." As the morning lessons continued, Colt found himself thinking about the man he had been 5 years earlier, so focused on legacy and bloodlines that he had nearly missed the opportunity for real love and meaningful purpose. The ranch prospered, the cattle were healthy, and the Ashford name was respected throughout the territory. But none of that compared to the satisfaction of watching Maybel help a struggling student understand a difficult concept, or seeing Sarah Rose's face light up when he returned from his daily rounds. That evening, as they sat together in the parlor, Sarah Rose asleep in the once empty rocking chair, the baby shoes from the schoolhouse arranged on the mantelpiece like trophies, Colt and Maybel, reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had accepted that position in Philadelphia?" Maybelle asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "I try not to," Colt admitted. "The thought of all we would have missed, Sarah Rose, these children we teach, this life we've built together, it's too frightening to contemplate." "I think about it sometimes," she said, "not with regret, but with gratitude. I was so focused on what I thought I wanted that I almost missed what I actually needed." "And what was that?" "A partner who saw me clearly from the very beginning, even when his own vision was clouded by practical concerns. A man brave enough to risk his pride for love and wise enough to recognize that the best legacies aren't inherited, they're earned through service to others." The baby shoes on the mantelpiece caught the firelight, each tiny pair representing a child who had been touched by their care and commitment. In the morning, there would be new lessons to teach, new challenges to face, and Sarah Rose would wake with the boundless energy of a toddler discovering the world. But tonight, there was only this, the quiet contentment of two people who had found in each other exactly what they hadn't known they were looking for. Outside, Wyoming stretched endlessly under the stars, as wild and challenging as ever. But inside the Ashford house, in the heart of a love story that had begun with the most practical of propositions and had grown into something neither of them could have imagined, all was exactly as it should be. The empty rocking chair would never be empty again.